It began with silence, the kind that doesn't belong to a quiet street, but to something deeper, older, waiting beneath the noise of ordinary life. I had lived on that street for years without noticing the way shadows shifted across the neighbor's porch at dusk, or how a single light always flickered behind their upstairs window long after midnight. Maybe I was too busy, or maybe I simply didn't want to see, but that all changed the night I heard a soft humming through the wall, a tune so strange and sorrowful it felt less like a song and more like a memory I had forgotten was mine. That was the first time I realized something about that house, and the person inside it, was quietly rewriting the shape of my life. Before I tell you what happened, I need to ask one small thing. If you find yourself drawn into this story, if you can feel the same pull I once did toward that mysterious hum and the secrets that followed, then stay with me. Like, share, and subscribe, not as a formality, but as a way to keep this strange current between us alive. Because some stories are not meant to be consumed alone. The first time I noticed the house next door, it was not because of how it looked, but because of how it waited. There was something patient about it, something too still for a place that had once belonged to laughter and routine. The paint on its siding peeled in long, brittle curls, exposing the pale wood beneath like a body shedding skin. Even the ivy that crept up its foundation seemed to have stopped mid-climb, frozen in an uncertain reach. It wasn't abandoned, I knew that much. Yet it carried the quiet of abandonment, the kind of silence that feels personal, as though the house itself were holding its breath. I used to pass it every morning on my way to work. The same rhythm, the same walk, my mind dulled by repetition. I never looked twice at it until one evening, a slant of amber light caught the window on the second floor. The glass shimmered briefly, and behind it I thought I saw movement, just a hand drawing the curtain shut. It was the smallest gesture, but something about it pulled me in. That hand lingered in my mind through dinner, through the hollow drone of television voices, through the dim hush that comes when a house settles for the night. I couldn't explain why I cared, only that a door I didn't know existed had quietly opened somewhere inside me. Nights became heavier after that. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to. The rhythm of footsteps on the creaking wood porch, the faint glow of a lamp shifting color as hours passed, the soft scrape of something moving just beyond sight. It was as though the house had always been whispering, but I was only now learning to listen. I began to imagine the person inside, who they were, what they did alone with their light burning so late. The possibilities came like fever dreams, each one more vivid than the last. Sometimes they were an artist, surrounded by half-finished canvases and cigarette smoke. Sometimes an exile, hiding from something they could never name. And sometimes, when my mind refused to sleep, I thought they might be someone like me. Someone waiting for their life to mean something again. The street itself seemed to react to my curiosity. Lights flickered more often, dogs barked at nothing. The air grew thick with the smell of rain that never came. People passed my house but never lingered. I started leaving my windows cracked open, hoping for a sound, a clue, a reason. Once I thought I heard a faint hum, so low I wasn't sure if it was real. It came from the wall that divided our homes. A fragile vibration, almost tender. I pressed my ear against the plaster and waited. It stopped, then started again, a melody just beyond recognition. That was the moment the house stopped being a structure and became a presence, something alive. Something aware, days bled into nights. I began keeping the lights off just to watch that upstairs window. Sometimes it glowed with a dim yellow warmth. Other times it was pure darkness. I memorized its patterns as though decoding a secret language. There was a strange comfort in that routine, an intimacy built from distance. I never told anyone. It felt too delicate, too easily ruined by words. When I walked by neighbors, I could almost feel their eyes slide past me, unaware of the quiet obsession taking root beneath my calm expression. The world around me continued. Cars, laughter, deadlines. But I was living for glimpses, for that single flicker of light behind the curtain. One afternoon, I saw the neighbor in passing for the first time. It was raining, the kind that doesn't pour but lingers, as though undecided. They stood at their porch, face tilted slightly upward, letting the drizzle run down their cheeks. I froze. There was nothing remarkable about their appearance, nothing that should have set them apart from anyone else. Yet I felt something shift, as if a gravity existed between us that neither of us had chosen. They looked at me then, not with curiosity or recognition, but with something far more complicated. It was the look of someone who already knew how the story would end. After that, every sound from their house felt deliberate, like a coded message. A door closing softly became a sigh. The thud of a step meant departure. The creak of a chair meant return. I started sleeping by the window, letting the hum of their presence replace the silence in my head. I told myself it was harmless, a fascination born of loneliness. But deep down, I knew it was becoming something else. The house had begun to breathe again, and somehow so had I. One night, as the city settled into its familiar pulse, I caught sight of that upstairs light again, but this time it flickered 3 times before going dark. It was such a small thing, yet it sent a chill through me, like the first line of a story written in a language I was about to learn. I stood there for a long time, watching the blank window reflect the moon. My heart beat in that stillness, echoing faintly against the walls. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I understood one truth with sudden, startling clarity. Whatever lived next door was no longer just my neighbor. It had become a mirror, and from that night forward, I could no longer tell if I was watching them, or if they had been watching me all along. The first hum came just past midnight, threading through the wall like a pulse. It was not music, not entirely, but something rawer, a vibration caught between grief and longing. I lay awake, holding my breath, afraid that even the sound of moving would break whatever fragile connection had formed between us. It rose and fell in uneven waves, trembling softly, until it found a rhythm that felt painfully familiar. I didn't recognize the tune, yet I knew what it meant. It was the sound of someone trying not to disappear. At first, I told myself it was nothing more than a trick of thin walls, an echo of the city folded into the quiet hours. But the next night it returned. Same time, same pitch, same aching consistency. I pressed my ear against the cool plaster, eyes closed, letting it fill me. Each hum seemed to travel through my bones, stirring something I had buried long ago. The echo of my mother's voice when she used to sing beneath her breath while washing dishes. The hum of lullabies she never finished before fading into silence. I hadn't thought about her in years, not since the day she stopped speaking altogether. Yet here, through a stranger's wall, her ghost began to sing again. Days blurred, sleepless and restless. I started rearranging my life around the sound. I'd wait for it in the evenings, sitting near the wall with a cup of cold coffee, counting the seconds until it began. Sometimes I thought I heard a second voice join, fainter, trembling, unsure. Mine. Without meaning to, I had started to hum back. It was tentative at first, almost embarrassed, but something about it felt right, like answering a question I didn't know had been asked. I would match the pitch, then drift lower, then fall silent to see if the neighbor noticed. They always did. The melody would shift slightly in response, adjusting, acknowledging. It became a conversation without words. That fragile exchange became my secret ritual. Nights no longer felt empty. They felt charged with meaning. I started to imagine the person behind the wall sitting exactly as I was, back against plaster, listening, waiting. Sometimes, when the hum stopped abruptly, I felt a strange panic, as though a lifeline had been cut. I would wait, heart pounding until it returned. When it did, the relief was almost holy. I began noticing small changes in the daylight. The neighbors' curtains no longer stayed drawn. Sometimes I'd catch them slightly open, the faint outline of someone moving behind them. Once, a shadow paused, perfectly still, before turning toward my window. I froze, caught mid-gaze, and for a heartbeat, it felt like our eyes met through the glass, through the air, through the wall. through everything that was supposed to separate us. There was no smile, no wave, just recognition. The hum came again that night, softer than usual, as if the melody itself were holding its breath. It wasn't long before the music began to follow me. I'd catch myself hearing it in the rhythm of passing cars, the hiss of the kettle, even the mechanical buzz of the elevator at work. Once, in a crowded room, I thought I heard it beneath the chatter, a faint undertone that no one else seemed to notice. It had become part of me, stitched into my thoughts. When I closed my eyes, I could see the notes as faint ripples in the dark, shimmering like heat on asphalt. The connection had grown beyond proximity. It had become something internal, something living between heartbeat and thought. One night the hum changed. It trembled, broken, hesitant, like someone trying to speak but finding no words. I moved closer to the wall, pressing my palms against it, whispering without sound. Then, as if hearing me, the neighbor knocked. Just once. A slow, deliberate tap that carried through the plaster like a confession. I froze, then lifted my hand and answered with one knock in return. The silence that followed was unbearable. And then came two more knocks, softer like a sigh. It wasn't random. It was language, primitive and urgent. I didn't know what we were saying, but I felt it. The exchange of loneliness, the ache of recognition, the promise that neither of us was entirely invisible. After that, the hums and knocks began to merge into a kind of nightly duet. Some nights it lasted minutes, others stretched toward dawn. I started seeing the world differently, as if every shadow, every creak, every echo was alive with meaning. My friends noticed my distraction. My family asked if I was well, but how could I explain something so delicate without destroying it? The truth would sound absurd, that my neighbor and I were speaking through silence, that the distance between us had become the only space where I felt real. Then, one night, it stopped. The hum, the knocks, everything, they'd gone. The air felt wrong, too quiet. I waited for hours, pacing, whispering into the void, hoping for an answer that never came. When dawn finally broke, I pressed my forehead against the wall and realized my reflection was trembling in the window pane. The street outside looked unchanged, the same trees, the same damp air. But the house next door felt hollow, as if something had left it for good. I should have let it end there. I should have taken the silence as mercy, but I couldn't. I needed to know what had happened, why the music had stopped, why the connection had been severed. Curiosity had turned to dependence and dependence to hunger. So when the light appeared again behind that window 2 nights later, faint but alive, I knew what I had to do. I had to cross the threshold. It took me 2 full days to gather the courage. Though courage might not be the right word. It wasn't bravery that pushed me toward that door. It was compulsion, the same force that drives a moth to a flame, knowing it will die in the light. The silence after the humming had become unbearable. Every second without it felt like standing at the edge of an unfinished sentence, trapped between what had been said and what was still waiting to be spoken. I couldn't eat, couldn't work, couldn't sleep. My body had become a tuning fork for absence. On the 3rd night, I stood at my window and watched the faint glow return to that upstairs room. The hum didn't come, but the light pulsed softly like a heartbeat beneath skin. That was enough. I stepped outside. The street was slick with rain and the air smelled like wet metal and pine. Every footstep echoed louder than I expected, as though the world were warning me to turn back. But I didn't. The closer I came to that house, the slower I moved, studying every detail. The chipped paint, the rust on the doorknob, the way the curtains in the downstairs window shifted slightly, as if something had just moved behind them. My pulse quickened, my hand trembling as I lifted it to knock. For a long moment I hesitated, half expecting some sign, a sound, a shadow, anything to tell me I was not alone. Then I knocked once. The sound was swallowed instantly. The house seemed to absorb it. I waited, the seconds stretching so thin I could almost hear my heartbeat echoing through the wood. Then faintly footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. When the door opened, it wasn't with surprise or suspicion, but with quiet inevitability. as though I had been expected. They stood there, the neighbor, in the dim light of a single candle. Their face was softer than I had imagined, tired but gentle, with eyes that seemed to carry the reflection of too many sleepless nights. The candlelight trembled across their features, turning their expression into something shifting and unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain pattered against the steps, filling the silence between us. Then they stepped aside, wordlessly inviting me in. The air inside the house was heavy, filled with the faint scent of dust and something older, like books that had forgotten how to be read. The walls were lined with photographs, though every frame had been turned face down. Only one remained upright. A faded image of a woman sitting by a window, a child at her feet. The edges were worn, fingerprints smudged into the glass. I wanted to ask who she was, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I followed them into the living room, where the candle cast its trembling light across the furniture. "Why did you stop?" I asked finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. They looked at me with something like confusion, then sadness. "Because you started to listen," they said. The words hung between us, strange and heavy. I didn't understand, not fully, but I felt them like a weight pressing into my chest. We stood there in that dim, flickering light, two people bound by something that existed beyond logic. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, alive, filled with everything neither of us dared to say. They gestured toward the wall that divided our homes, the same one that had carried their hum to me night after night. "It was never meant to reach you," they said softly. "It's not a song. It's a memory." Their voice broke on that last word, and in the wavering candlelight, I saw the faintest tremor in their hand. They moved toward a corner of the room where a small tape recorder sat on a table, surrounded by dusty reels of magnetic tape. They pressed play. The same hum, that same fragile, trembling sound, filled the room. But this time, layered beneath it, was another voice. My mother's. Singing. I staggered backward, breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be real. My mind rejected it, yet the sound was unmistakable. Her tone, her phrasing, even the slight waver in her voice when she reached for a note too high. I felt my knees weaken. How do you have that?" I asked. They didn't answer right away. Instead, they turned the volume down until it was barely audible, a ghost of a melody drifting through the air. "She lived here before me," they said finally. "Years ago, she left behind the tapes." The room tilted, reality bending beneath the weight of those words. Memories flooded back. The move, the years after she was gone, the way I had built walls inside myself to keep the grief contained. And now, here it was, seeping through a different wall, into a stranger's life, into mine again. They looked at me with a kind of fragile understanding. "I didn't mean to draw you in," they whispered. "I just wanted to remember her too." We stood there in silence, listening to the faint hum that had once been her voice. The candle burned lower, its light shrinking to a trembling wick. I wanted to say something, to thank them, to curse them, to ask how they had known it was her, but the words refused to form. In that quiet, something between us broke open, raw and unguarded. Two lives, once separate, now entwined by sound and sorrow. When I finally left, dawn was beginning to smear pale light across the horizon. The rain had stopped and the street glistened like glass. I turned once to look back at the house. The candlelight still flickered faintly behind the curtains, and for a moment I thought I saw her shadow there. Not the neighbor's, but my mother's. The shape of her head tilted, listening, waiting. I walked home with the echo of that hum still inside me, no longer sure where the song ended and where I began. And though I told myself it was over, I knew I would never stop hearing it. Because once you cross a threshold like that, you don't go back. The walls between lives never rebuild themselves. They only grow thinner. The days that followed were quieter, though not in any way that felt peaceful. It was the kind of silence that presses against your skin, that hums just beneath hearing, like an old radio signal trying to tune itself back to life. I told myself I wouldn't go back to that house, that what I had found there should have been enough. But the truth was that I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every detail lingered: the turned-down photographs, the flickering candle, the way their voice trembled when they spoke my mother's name. It haunted me, and not just because of what it revealed, but because of how it changed the shape of everything I thought I knew about grief. Word began to spread on the street. People noticed the lights that stayed on too late, the quiet figures seen at windows long after midnight. Someone mentioned seeing me leave their house at dawn. Someone else whispered that I'd been spending nights there. It didn't take long for curiosity to turn into suspicion. Small towns, quiet streets, they have a way of devouring secrets whole. I tried to ignore it, to keep my world small, but rumor seeps through walls faster than sound. Even family began to ask questions. My sister called one evening, her voice brittle with forced calm. "You've been distant," she said. "Everyone's talking." I wanted to tell her everything, but the words jammed in my throat. How could I explain that what I had found wasn't madness, but meaning? That I had touched something sacred in that house, something that defied reason? Instead, I lied. I said I was fine. But I wasn't. Nights blurred again into that old, feverish state. I started hearing the hum even when I knew there was no tape playing. It became part of the house's heartbeat, mine too. The walls felt thinner, softer, almost porous. Sometimes I could swear I smelled candle smoke, faint and sweet, even though no flame burned. I'd wake in the dark, half expecting to find her, my mother, standing in the doorway, humming the way she used to when I was a child. But it was always just shadows, shapes that dissolved when I reached for them. One afternoon, I saw the neighbor again, standing by their fence. They looked exhausted, their face pale and hollow-eyed. Between us lay the stretch of wet grass, glistening under a gray sky. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then they said, "You shouldn't come here anymore." Something inside me recoiled, like an old wound reopening. "Why?" Their gaze dropped to the ground. "Because it's not helping. Not you, not me. It's keeping us both somewhere we're not meant to stay." The words should have made sense, but they didn't. It felt like betrayal, though I couldn't explain why. I wanted to scream that they were wrong, that this connection was all that kept me from unraveling completely. But I could see it in their face, the fear, the regret. Whatever we had shared had become too heavy to carry. When they turned and walked back inside, the door closing softly behind them, it sounded like an ending I wasn't ready to accept. From that day on, I felt the street watching me. Curtains moved when I passed, whispers flickered at my back. Even at work, there was a stiffness in people's eyes, a politeness stretched too thin. My sister stopped calling. My father left me a message I couldn't bring myself to play. I started losing time, minutes, sometimes hours. I'd find myself standing at my window, staring at the neighbor's house without remembering how I'd gotten there. The light in the upstairs window no longer flickered. It stayed dark. Then, one night, a sound broke the silence. Not the hum, but something sharper. Glass shattering. I was out the door before I could think, barefoot on the cold pavement, rain stinging my skin. When I reached their porch, the front door stood ajar, wind pushing it back and forth in slow, rhythmic creaks. Inside, the air felt wrong, too still, too cold. I called their name, but no one answered. The candle on the table had burned down to nothing. The photographs were gone. So was the tape recorder. Only one thing remained on the floor near the wall we shared. A single reel of magnetic tape, unspooled and tangled like a nest of veins. I picked it up, trembling. It was blank. Or maybe erased? I couldn't tell. But as I held it, I felt that same faint vibration running through my fingertips, the ghost of a sound that refused to die completely. I stumbled back home, the reel pressed to my chest like a relic. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the floor beside the wall, the tape coiled beside me, waiting for something to happen. I told myself I'd throw it away in the morning. But when dawn came, I couldn't. I placed it on my table and left it there, as though daring it to start humming on its own. The days that followed blurred into something dreamlike. I barely left the house. Food lost its taste. Time felt suspended. I thought about visiting again, but when I finally forced myself to cross the street, the house was empty. A for sale sign leaned crooked in the yard. The windows were boarded. The air around it felt hollow, stripped of whatever strange life had once filled it. The neighbor was gone, and with them, the connection that had redefined my world. Yet, late at night, when the city quieted and the walls seemed to breathe again, I could still hear it. Faint, persistent, patient. The hum, not from their house but from mine. From within the walls that had once divided us, that was when I understood. You can't erase sound once it's been heard. It lingers, looping through the body, finding new places to live. The hum wasn't just a memory or a haunting. It was inheritance, and it was mine now. But as the nights grew longer, that inheritance began to feel less like connection and more like collapse. Time has a strange way of softening memory, or at least disguising it. The weeks after the neighbor's disappearance unfolded in fragments, like film reels left too long in the sun. Images fading at the edges, moments half erased by light. The house next door remained empty, though the sign in the yard grew crooked. The paint on the windowsills flaked away, and weeds began to crawl up through the cracks in the walkway. The world moved on without ceremony, as it always does. But I couldn't. The hum had settled inside me, a low, persistent vibration that never ceased. Even silence had texture now. Even dreams had sound. Some mornings I would wake convinced that everything had been a kind of fever. That the nights of humming, the candlelight, the voice of my mother in a stranger's house had been some elaborate construction of grief. But then I'd feel it again. That pulse in the air, soft but deliberate, like breath moving through the walls. It would rise just as the sun touched the horizon, hum faintly through the first light, and then disappear, leaving behind the same hollow ache it always did. I began recording the silence, hour after hour of nothing, hoping to catch it again. When I played the tapes back, I could swear I heard it, so faint I had to strain to believe it was there. Yet even when it wasn't, I could feel it vibrating beneath my ribs, inside the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. People stopped asking about the neighbor after a while. Their absence became a story without an ending, one the street preferred not to tell. Sometimes, I'd catch the mail carrier lingering by their gate, glancing at the darkened windows before shaking their head and moving on. Other times, I'd see the new realtor showing the place to strangers, none of whom stayed long. I watched from my window as one couple walked through the rooms, their voices echoing against bare walls. The woman paused by the staircase, her expression tightening as if she'd heard something faint, something just beyond comprehension. She touched her husband's arm, said something I couldn't hear, and they both turned and left. The sign went back up the next morning. My own house began to change. I noticed it first in small ways. The creak of a floorboard that hadn't existed before, the faint scent of candle wax that would appear and vanish, the way shadows gathered near the wall after sunset. I told myself it was imagination, a trick of exhaustion. But one night, I woke to the sound of the reel, the one I'd taken from their floor, spinning on its own. The tape player sat in the corner where I had left it, untouched for weeks, yet the spools turned slowly, whispering against the magnetic strip. I froze, listening. At first there was nothing but static, the soft hiss of an empty channel. Then came the hum, faint, cracked, almost human. And beneath it, my name. It wasn't my mother's voice. And it wasn't the neighbor's, not entirely. It was something in between, as if the two had merged into one lingering echo. I sat there in the dark, paralyzed, listening as it repeated. Softer each time, more distorted, until the hum dissolved into silence again. When the reel finally stopped spinning, I realized I was crying, though I didn't remember starting. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt something closer to peace. It was as if the universe had folded in on itself just to let me hear one last message. that nothing ever truly disappears. The next morning, I found the wall warm to the touch. It pulsed faintly beneath my palm, steady, rhythmic. The same place I had once pressed my ear to listen now seemed to breathe back at me. I leaned closer, and for the first time in months, I heard a sound that was not the hum, but something softer, like a whisper just beneath the surface. It said only one word: listen. I began spending my nights there again, sitting by the wall, waiting. I stopped going to work. The phone went unanswered. The world beyond that small room blurred into irrelevance. All that mattered was the sound. Some nights it came from the wall, others from the air itself, an invisible current threading through the house, through me. I wasn't sure anymore whether it was external or something my mind had created to keep itself from fracturing. But the distinction no longer mattered. It felt real enough to belong. In time, I started humming back again the way I used to. The notes came easier this time, rising instinctively, filling the quiet with fragile resonance. It wasn't imitation anymore. It was continuation. I began to realize that perhaps the hum had never belonged to anyone, not to the neighbor, not even to my mother. It was something older, something passed from one lonely soul to another, an inheritance of sound shared between walls and lives. Each of us had simply carried it for a while before letting it move on. The seasons changed. The house next door remained empty, yet sometimes I could see a faint light flickering behind the boarded windows. Too dim to be real, too rhythmic to be imagined. The street grew overgrown, wildflowers pushing through the cracks, the air thick with the smell of rain and old wood. I rarely left my room anymore. The recordings piled up, tapes labeled with dates and hours, all filled with the same thin, trembling sound. Somewhere in those endless reels I knew was the truth of everything. The moment where my mother's voice met the neighbor's, where my life folded into theirs. Now at night I keep the window open. The air moves softly through the curtains, carrying the faint hum outward, letting it drift down the empty street. Sometimes when I listen closely, I think I can hear another voice answering from far away, hesitant, searching, just beginning to learn the tune. I wonder if they too will one day find themselves drawn to a wall, listening for something that feels like both a memory and a promise. The hum no longer frightens me. It lives inside everything now, the wind, the floorboards, the spaces between words. It reminds me that connection, once made, never truly fades. We are echoes, all of us, resonating through time, through grief, through love unspoken. And as I sit here in the half-light, the wall warm beneath my hand, I realize the truth that has waited all along. My neighbor didn't change my life. They revealed it. The hidden rhythm beneath the noise, the fragile music that keeps everything from collapsing into silence. Outside, dawn begins to rise, pale and uncertain. The air hums, and somewhere, through the walls, through the years, through the heart that still remembers, a voice hums back. The echo remains.